Good evening again, everyone. I want to invite you back for a very special episode of Learning with My Rabbis. This week we have a very special rabbi, Rabbi Joel Dinin, who's coming to us from Lake Park Synagogue in Milwaukee. But even more, Rabbi Dinin actually grew up at the same synagogue as me, a few blocks away from where I grew up, and we had a lot of the same things in common, and later became very good friends, spending a year together studying in Israel before we went to our respective rabbinical schools. So it's really a pleasure, Rabbi Dinin, to have you with us tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Sachs. Thank you, Louis. I'm really excited about this. We get to hang out as friends, but it's fun to actually chat as colleagues.
Well, we've had many different chats. I remember we were both studying at Pardes in, I think it was 2010 to 2011. And that was when I was still deciding what exactly I wanted to do as a rabbi, which school I wanted to apply to, what I really believed in terms of a whole bunch of different theological and philosophical things. And you were there. You were having these conversations with me and helped me through a lot of them as a friend, but also as a teacher, which is why it's so great tonight to share your Torah today with my community here in Toronto.
Thank you.
So let's go back maybe a little bit, and let's just start there. It's where I go with most of the rabbis in the programs. What is it that made you want to be a rabbi?
This is a question that I've answered at every job interview I've had since I became a rabbi, and I recognize that every time I do it, it's a little different, and part of that is because there's no one thing that made me want to become a rabbi. I realized, in fact, a number of years ago, I was meeting with some colleagues from like other religions, and they were talking about this thing, the calling. I think it's something in Christianity. And all of the Jews that were with me, all of us looked at each other like, what does that mean to be called? For us, it was all an organic process. So the major points on that journey that led me to becoming a rabbi is, one is the household I was raised in. My father, alav shalom, and my mother, who's alive and well and doing well in California, both raised me with a strong sense of Judaism. So no matter what, Judaism was going to be a huge part of my life. But when I was in high school, I thought I was going to go into theater. And then I started getting involved in Camp Ramah, because that's what everyone was doing. And I started to fall in love with Jewish education. And then by the time I got to college, I slowly started teaching part-time in a Hebrew school. And I said, I love this. I want to be a Jewish educator. But then the real big shift was actually one of your previous interviewees, Rabbi Erez Sherman. I was learning with him because he's a rabbi at the assistant rabbi at the synagogue I grew up at the time. And he was sitting with me and I said, I want to be a Jewish educator. And he said, it's so powerful, it's so beautiful. But if you do become a rabbi, it gives you a lot more opportunities to reach out to people and connect to people. And not just a child in a classroom for 1 year, but you can be with people through their whole life cycle. And that's the moment that I knew I want to be a Jewish educator, but I also want to be a rabbi. So then I picked my rabbinic school, and we can talk more about why I chose the one I did. But when I started, I knew I wanted to be a Jewish educator rabbi. And the founder of the school, Rav Avi Weiss, really pushed guys to explore, really hoped they would go into synagogues so they could have more of a global impact. And I don't remember the exact moment. I think it was just an internship that I did just to try it out. And I just fell in love with it on the spot and said, now I think I want to be in a synagogue. So it wasn't one moment, but it was a love of Judaism. Then it was an experience of teaching really Camp Ramah, made me fall in love with Jewish education. And Erez Sherman, Rabbi Sherman, was like, being a rabbi is really one of the most effective ways to be a Jewish educator. And then getting in a synagogue and saying, I love this, and being able to reach people at so many different points in their life.
It's beautiful, and we have so much in common in that story, because a big part of my own shift from wanting to just be a Jewish educator / I was also interested in an MBA, maybe running a Jewish nonprofit, was another staff member, our executive director at the time at the synagogue, Jessica, who encouraged me to think maybe more broadly of the rabbinate as a place that gets to combine those two goals of teaching and kind of the vision of an organization. So you mentioned a little bit there, right, that Rav Avi Weiss, right, he's the founder of Yeshiva Chovevei Torah, which is where you went, which is a Orthodox Rabbinical School. And before we go into the specifics of the school, I'd love to get a little bit more about your background of, you grew up at Shomrei Torah, the same synagogue I did, a conservative synagogue. You grew up at conservative summer camp, Camp Ramah. I know you were a day school student as well. And I'm not sure if Milken, I don't think it's officially a conservative school, but it's
non-denominational.
non-denominational. So
Officially,
what is
like
it
it's a
that,
community school.
what is it then, though, from those kinds of non-Orthodox institutions that shaped you and your education that led you to Orthodoxy?
Yeah. So again, as with the process of becoming a rabbi, it wasn't any one thing, but a lot of it goes back to my family and again, my father and the way he raised us with, even though it was in the conservative movement, it was a very observant home. And in many ways, early conservative Judaism, and this is a whole other conversation, early conservative Judaism and Orthodox, or at least the modern Orthodoxy, weren't so different, both philosophically and in terms of practice. So I grew up in a household where there were certain practices that were very in line with a typical conservative household, but like Shabbat was a major thing, kashrut was a major thing, all the holidays, et cetera, like that. So when I started going into these institutions, either I found that I was much more observant, not in a positive, negative, like judgy way, but like I found like I really didn't fit into a lot of those typical conservative or non-denominational institutions. Although at Camp Ramah, for the most part, I really did fit in there. And one of the things I found as the level of observance, at least institutionally, everyone kept kashrut, everyone was davening 2 to 3 times a day. And then I went back into the real world and said, or saw that Judaism wasn't quite as rich there. And I know that that's a challenge. And I do want to say that everything I am is so much gratitude towards what the conservative movement did for me, Camp Ramah and everything like that. I couldn't have grown if I hadn't started there. But again, when I went out, I realized that the way I was raised and my love of Judaism and my desire to grow in my observance wasn't being met by the conservative movement around me. And that shift started a little bit in Camp Ramah. And then even in Milken, it's non-denominational, they had a mechitza minyan. I started freshman year in the traditional egalitarian minyan. And then I shifted towards the mechitza minyan and I just connected with it more there. And that, again, it was a process that continued in college. I'm getting involved with the Chabad house there. And a lot of it came from just learning. And the more Torah I learned, the more I wanted to have an observant life. And the more I realized the conservative movement wasn't meeting my needs. And again, that's not an attack on it because it meets a lot of people's needs, but it wasn't right for what I needed. And then one of the important things that I kept, though, is that intellectual honesty, that openness, that recognition that Judaism, there is a way for it to change. It can and should change. But I looked at a different philosophy of that, the Orthodox one, and I ended up in Modern Orthodoxy, which I felt is more, not necessarily a compromise, but was able to meet all my needs.
It's interesting. Maybe we'll come back a little bit more to your school because I'd like to flesh this out a little bit. We've talked with a few of our guests about the borders and the edges of the conservative movement and what unites us because it's such a big tent. And right here in Toronto, there are no conservative synagogues that use musical instruments on Shabbat. And in Los Angeles, where we grew up, when we were kids, maybe there were a couple, but now it's very commonplace. There are, I think, the far majority of them, if not almost all of them, use musical instruments on Shabbat.
Yeah.
So we've had a couple of rabbis who talked about kind of where the edges are with Reform and conservative Judaism. That's, I think, more clear because we have some rules in the conservative movement. Things like intermarriage and things like that just put you on the left side out of the movement. But you, I think, occupy a unique place of living right in the Orthodox spectrum, but near that wall on the other end. So what is it in your mind that distinguishes kind of the right part, the more traditional wing of conservative Judaism from the more liberal wing of Orthodoxy? Is there a difference, or is it just what you affiliate with in the end?
Years ago, one of my good friends, we actually had a debate. I think it was on Shavuot. It's part of like the all-night learning where we talked about is liberal modern Orthodoxy basically just like an observant conservative? Is it like the new conservative Judaism? Or is it conservative Judaism as it was in like the 1950s? I don't remember who won. I'll just say that I won because I can say that because my friend's probably not going to listen. But I think there's a few parts of this conversation. One is the institutional reality of it, and one is my own personal connection. If I had grown up in the 1950s, maybe I would have stayed in the conservative movement. And also there are certain institutions today that are aligned with the conservative movement, but filled with people who are like very, very observant and richly, deeply involved in Torah. And had I been connected with those institutions 15, 16 years ago or so, maybe I'd still be in the movement. However, one of the really important things for me today is, regardless, and like this is very clear for me, well, I can't say I, have perfect faith. Like, I don't know if anyone does. I do believe in God. And by the way, I'm not saying conservative Jews don't, but I'm saying everything starts from there. And then I have a complete commitment to Jewish law. And I'm not saying that Orthodoxy has the 100%, they understand everything perfectly, but a complete and total commitment to Jewish law based on the Shulchan Aruch. Certainly it's come a long way in the last hundreds of years. But I align myself with the process, the people, and the rabbis of Orthodoxy. So practically speaking, I guess the lines are fairly clear in that there's a process for the change of Jewish law, and in some ways conservative and Orthodoxy just kind of disagree on that process. So that's really like the fence where it goes. But in terms of actual observance, again, what I see in the field from many conservative Jews or conservative synagogues, and what I see in my observance, there's a huge ocean there. So you said me being more liberal and more open. It depends on who you're asking. If you ask someone in the more Haredi community, I'm certainly not Orthodox. But if you ask somebody who just doesn't even know what mechitza, the separation between men and women, or an eruv, allowing one to carry on Shabbat, all those things I do, they would think that I'm like ultra Orthodox. So I think that's very important. One of the reasons I'm struggling with the answer here is because it's somewhat relative. So I certainly align myself with Orthodoxy, and the rabbis that I look to are ones that are accepted deciders of Jewish law. Like if I have a question about kashrut, et cetera, I'm not just going to go to some random blog and pick something because it's, it makes sense. I'm going to hold by the great Rav Moshe Feinstein Zatzal, or, certain, particularly rabbis in Israel, and the rabbis from my yeshiva, Rabbi Dov Linzer, Rabbi Avi Weiss, Rabbi Yaakov Love, et cetera. And I think that's actually a big part of defining Orthodoxy, is who are the rabbis that we often turn to, if people are turning to rabbis at all to help make their decisions.
I think that, at least from a congregational standpoint, is a big difference. Maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, but most of the questions I get from congregants tend not to be halachic, right? They might be spiritual, they might be more personal. It's not to say I don't get some halachic questions. And also, as the associate rabbi, a lot of people wouldn't come to me. They would go to our senior rabbi, the Maradach, for the community. But even so, I don't know that he gets so many halachic questions on a regular basis. But I have the impression that you might, right? That in your community that might be more common. But you can correct me if I'm wrong.
So it's funny you say that. Is in the modern Orthodox world, and again, I can't speak for every modern Orthodox rule, but at least a handful from New York, California, and certain places I'm in the Midwest right now, I'm in Milwaukee. A lot of modern Orthodox rabbis are typically at shuls where a lot of the congregation would probably fit more philosophically and in terms of observance in conservative or reform. And that's even when I grew up with my Rabbi Richard Camrus. I remember that I always looked to him, and I still look to him as like a great man and an inspiration, but he was always more observant than the congregation. So long before I was Orthodox, I learned that the rabbis are always more observant. And again, part of it comes with studying. When I was in college freshman year, I literally Friday afternoon, I sat down with a book and I'd read like 2 or 3 books, like relatively short books. And I got through like an overview of all of Jewish law. And I was like, oh, I should be keeping all of this. And there's a certain lack of education with a lot of people, and it's often not there. It's rarely their fault. But that separation between the observant rabbi and the congregation is still common in a lot of modern Orthodox shuls. Now, in my synagogue, I actually love my synagogue. It's very like small, intimate. We have a lot of people who are quite observant, would fit comfortably in modern Orthodoxy, and the ones who aren't often have a very strong education or a basis of faith. So I get a really mixed number of questions. I don't get like there's certain laws about what happens in a marriage between a man and a woman and things like that. I don't really get questions about that. But I definitely have a handful of congregants who will say, this holiday is coming up. What special prayer do I include in the morning prayers? Or I cooked this potato salad and I found a worm inside. What do I do? That happened. That was a real question. A week ago, there was a skunk involved. It was a wild, wild story. So it's funny. I would almost say it's an outsized percentage. I've been at bigger congregations where I got far fewer questions about practical Jewish law. And now at this smaller congregation, percentage-wise, I actually get more. But it's not consistent. Just because a shul is modern Orthodox does not mean that the people who go there are observant and ask the rabbi about Jewish law. Oftentimes they're connected to the traditional way of davening. But again, it's a real mix. And there are modern Orthodox rabbis where a significant percentage of their population is totally observant. There's no one model fits all, but it's very common, particularly in the Midwest, to have an Orthodox rabbi and a mix of observance among their congregation.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because I know in the conservative movement was really in its heyday in the 40s and 50s, there were so many communities that were led, actually, conservative congregations that were led by an Orthodox rabbi.
Yeah.
And it would really, I think, is that example of the rabbi sometimes being more observant than the community.
I mean, there are shuls in the... Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, please.
There are shuls in the Midwest where you have Orthodox rabbi. There's one I know of where it's, the black hat, which shouldn't pigeonhole a person, but that typical very Orthodox lifestyle. And there's no separation between men and women, which, again, putting that aside, that's a whole conversation about whether that should be, but that's essentially that model. So it's almost become codified in the Midwest. And there's a shul that I interviewed at that was struggling with their identity because, again, it was Orthodox rabbi, but with mixed seating. And they recognized that the modern Orthodox world was generally moving more towards, a traditional separation, the mechitza between men and women, but they were caught in that old school model of Orthodox rabbi, but, conservative in many other of their practices. So it'll be interesting in the next 10 years to see where everybody moves. In some ways, the Reform movement has been taking on more observance. The conservative movement, some have claimed that it's going to split in two. One side will move more towards either where it is or towards Reform, and one side will move more towards modern Orthodoxy. And in some ways, I am not alone. There are many, many men and women that have a very similar story to me that ended up in modern Orthodoxy. And maybe that's representational of what's going to happen to conservative Judaism over the next 10 or 20 years. Yeah, go ahead.
I'd say it's really interesting, actually. It's something I've talked about a little bit with some of my teachers back at Ziegler, and gotten a little bit of pushback for. But my question is always, right, my allegiance isn't to the movement, it's to Judaism. And while we have so much fear of the movement dying, which, again, I wouldn't enjoy to see the movement disappear. It's the movement that gave me this deep, meaningful connection to my tradition and heritage. But so many of the people from our synagogue that I grew up with are now Orthodox congregants, Orthodox rabbis, or conservative rabbis themselves, right? That they've gone into these different movements beyond. And to me, in a way, that's a success of the movement if we're bringing people closer into deeper connection with Judaism. And I think it's important to have that voice that speaks out for a way of modernization and right, living with modernity and some other values as part of our Judaism, embracing the outside world. But in a way, I see kind of the left wing of Orthodoxy, YCT, Yeshiva Chovei Torah, and Open Orthodoxy, and some of those voices as kind of being what the conservative movement was in the 40s and 50s, that kind of dissenting voice within that realm of traditional observance. So to me, in a way, right, even if our numbers are down, the movement's succeeding as long as we're bringing people closer. That's what our movement does, is a bridge to people to other movements. Then I'm okay with that, right? As a rabbi who wants a job in the conservative world, I'm less okay with that.
Yeah.
But as a rabbi who cares deeply about Yiddishkeit, then it seems to me a success. Right? You're a success of the movement. I'll claim you as our success story.
Well, I've heard it said before that Camp Ramah has done more for the modern Orthodox movement than the conservative movement. And I'm not gonna die on that hill, as it were, defending that. But certainly in my journey, that's been true. But there's a couple of important things you said. One is about where YCT is in terms of their philosophy. And again, you can follow up questions. We can talk more about my yeshiva and why I chose it, what it stands for. But one of the biggest criticisms of YCT, which I believe is also a very aggressive and untrue criticism of conservative Judaism, is to say that YCT is just going the way of conservative Judaism, will end up like them, which is a coded way of saying conservative Judaism isn't Judaism and YCT is going that direction. So I really don't think that's true. There may be people who start in that very liberal orthodoxy and end up having less observance, whatever that means, but that's a personal journey. Fundamentally, you talked about labels. So movements, it's important to have movements. There's a lot of resources they have. It's helpful to have a clear philosophy. It helps to be able to identify. But if you ask me at the end of the day, what does it mean that I'm modern Orthodox? The answer is quite simple. I am observant of Jewish law and the mitzvot, the commandments from the Torah, and I engage with modernity and try and strike a balance. And the Rosh Yeshiva, the head of YCT, and also now the president, Rabbi Dov Linzer, says it beautifully. I think this is him, and if he didn't say it, and it sounds smart, then I'll say that he said it, which is that when you have modernity and Jewish law together, you always try and find a way for them to work. However, when they don't, then traditional Jewish values and Jewish law wins out. And that's a tough place. And that's why there's still living debates here about the role of women rabbis. That's really where the biggest thing, but also homosexuality. Those are all the places where the tension can't be compromised, can't be worked together. Again, we'll see in 20 years. But I think that that's the reason that YCT is going to stay within the Orthodox sphere. But again, like you said, it meets people where they are. And there have been many examples where there's been a shul that has been dying, suffering, hemorrhaging members and money. And their board says, we got to try something different. Let's hire a YCT guy. And let's say there's only 50 people left. And there are two families that say, you hire that guy, and those liberal guys. And again, they often don't know what they're talking about, or they pick up on something that speaks of one person out of 100 at YCT and doesn't speak for the rest of the school. But they say, you hire someone from there, we'll leave the synagogue. And they hire him. And those two families leave. And then what happens? 10 new families come and the shul thrives. There's one here in the Midwest that, again, a shul that was struggling, and now they're bursting at the seams, and they're doing incredible work in the Jewish world. So the value of meeting people where they are and still standing by integrity and values and striking that balance is important. But to say, here's where I am, either you're here where I am or I want nothing to do with you, can only go so far. Sometimes it's successful, but in the long run, I imagine it won't be.
I'm a little nervous now that some board members might be watching this, and I might find a YCT graduate in my place next year. No, it's an excellent point, right? And the labels are tough, right? I love what you talked about before about how, right, there's a spectrum and there's always someone who's more religious and always someone who's less. And that to me has always motivated me when I've heard people in the conservative world who kind of look down their nose to the left at the Reform or Reconstructionists, and even some of these other denominations and schools that have been popping up of really non-denominational and Aleph and all sorts of other things, right? That it's always struck me really as silly, because we know what it feels like as conservative being pretty much in the middle of having all sorts of people on our right turning to their left and looking down at us. And I know that even in the Orthodox world, right, I imagine that you've had that experience as well, right?
So I think YCT can really empathize with that. And one of the things that is constantly a struggle and a discussion is YCT is trying to satisfy everybody on both sides. Now, historically, we've actually been much better creating positive relations with, the so-called left, with the Reform, the conservative movements, et cetera, like that. But then we're always trying to do something to satisfy the right. And one of the things that we often forget is that when we talk about the right, and I don't mean this pejoratively, but let's say just as a label, the Haredi ultra-Orthodox world, and they pick on Chovevei, and we take it so personally to recognize they're picking on everybody. And why they're doing it, a lot of it might be sincere and caring about the future of Judaism. There might be politics, whatever reason is, they're picking on everybody. So, we can't take it so personally. Oftentimes, there's a lot more tension, though, with YCT and other modern Orthodox institutions and trying to, like, who is modern Orthodox? And as far as I know now, YCT is the only modern Orthodox yeshiva in America, because Yeshiva University, which was for decades the preeminent modern Orthodox institution, and anyone can correct me if I'm wrong, I believe they no longer identify as modern Orthodox. They're centrist Orthodox now, which is their way of saying, we are the center. We're the ones who are moderate on the middle path. And practically speaking, many of the students there and many of the students at YCT, in terms of their observance, their philosophy, their theology, it's not really much of a difference. A lot of it is, again, in the labels and a political battle, and partly it's jobs. And that's one of the things that's, I think you said it beautifully. At the end of the day, look, I want to get a job, but I also want Jews to be able to find their path towards Judaism and God. And I have a family to support, so I have to strike that balance.
Yeah. So maybe now we've talked a bunch around the topic. Maybe now's a good time, just for any of my viewers who aren't familiar with, to talk a little bit about what Yeshiva Chovevei Torah is and what Rabbi Avi Weiss started there.
So you'd probably have to ask Rabbi Weiss exactly what he had in mind, because there's several different variations of why he started it. But he himself was a graduate of Yeshiva University. He learned with the great Rabbi Soloveitchik Zatzal. And by the way, Zatzal, I've said twice, it's an acronym in Hebrew for may their memory be for a blessing, which is often appended to the names of great people. And he was a graduate there, but he was also one of the greatest men in history, I'll say that unequivocally, in terms of social justice, supporting Jews getting out of Russia and other civil rights matter, protesting, et cetera, like that. So I'm not saying that that is the reason that he founded YCT, but know that he was taking a very different path than the typical synagogue rabbi. And he really wanted to help bring a lot of those positive values and change and social movement and progression into the Jewish world. And one of the ways I think, and again, he can speak for himself more beautifully than I can, I think that was one of the things that was driving him, and he wasn't seeing that so much at YU. Now, the version that I heard is that he actually felt that the rabbis at YU were learning to be incredible scholars, but they weren't necessarily getting the best education to be rabbis, pastoral counseling. And in fact, YCT still, as far as I know, has one of the strongest pastoral counseling programs, certainly of an Orthodox institution. And in fact, YU has done incredible work in expanding it. And what I've been told is that they actually went to some of the people who worked with YCT and got ideas and said, how can we expand it? So I think there were a number of reasons Rabbi Weiss started YCT, to create rabbis to be professional rabbis, not just men who wanted to learn Torah and get the title of rabbi. And I don't mean that as an attack. There's nothing wrong with that, to learn Torah for 4 years. But everyone I went with at YCT, no one was there just to learn. We all wanted to learn so that we could be leaders and help either just support people. Like, my thing is not necessarily to change the world. It's to help people on their journey towards discovering and understanding Judaism. But some of the guys wanted to be more progressive and for social action. And all the YCT guys are a little different in what they wanted to do. But Rabbi Weiss created a school of men who wanted to be leaders. And then, of course, he also started a school for women who wanted to be leaders in Modern Orthodoxy, Maharat, which is also an acronym. But I think that's why he started it. So not to hurt any other institution, but to create a more focused rabbi that could really help change the Jewish world.
It's fascinating as you're talking about it, though, right? This idea of it was meant for people that wanted to be leaders, but also, I know one of the things that Yeshiva University has is so many people who go there and then go on to become doctors or lawyers or accountants or something else, but they got their smicha from Yeshiva University. Yeah. And I guess at this point, right, YCT doesn't really have a lot of students like that. But I believe, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, like the financial setup for students is very similar to that, in that it's really available financially for people to go there and study, which is a big problem, I think, in the non-Orthodox world of institutions of higher Jewish learning. I'm in more debt than I want to talk about from becoming a rabbi. And I think it prevents a lot of people from perhaps pursuing the path, and also other people who might be better suited for other forms of rabbinic work, whether it's day schools or hillels or things like that. pursuing instead careers like the pulpit, where there's a better chance that they're going to be able to pay back their loans than the other one.
Yeah.
But did you find that changed kind of the atmosphere of learning for you? The fact that the Orthodox community supports these institutions financially in such a way that you weren't putting yourself in that kind of debt as a rabbinical student?
Yeah. So two things I want to start with. One is you may be in debt, but you do have a master's, though. That's something that's YCT does not have. I believe YU does. And I will say one caveat, or not caveat, but one footnote on myself is anyone who watches this, and here's the way I talk about YU. When I was looking for rabbinical schools, I was looking at YU seriously. I have a great deal of respect, and I think I could have been very successful there. If anyone says, no, you're wrong, YU is meant to create great Torah leaders. Certainly today, they absolutely have, a really incredible program, pastoral counseling, and I might be wrong. I'm very willing to admit I'm wrong. I'm just saying, based on what you said, is I know for a fact that many rabbis got smicha on the side, and that's not to diminish them being rabbis, but the financial part was a big thing. A lot of rabbis in the 60s and 50s would be doing night school to become lawyers and then learning to be rabbis during the day. So to become a rabbi and support one's family is really tough. And I'll give a shout out to my congregation who have been so supportive and really making sure that my family is taken care of. And they've invested in me, so I want to stay here. And that's so important. When an institution invests in what's important, then they'll get, good product. And the same with schools. We don't invest in our teachers, so we don't have it's a struggle to find good teachers. So the YCT model of paying these young men, and I'm saying men because YCT is only men, but Maharad, I believe it's a similar model, of paying these young guys to become rabbis. Their philosophy is they don't want us having a side job. They don't want us struggling to make ends meet. They want us to be able to focus on being there in the yeshiva. And by the way, part of the interview process is not, hey, do you just want to come learn and get ordination here? It's what smicha means. They want to make sure that we are leaders of the highest caliber and that we will share the values of the yeshiva and spread it, all over the world. So I think that the fact that Orthodox schools invest in the rabbis does make a major impact. And what's interesting, though, is Orthodox schools tend not to be able to pay as much as the other denominations. So while YCT has made an incredible investment in making and helping to teach these rabbis, actually finding jobs that one can have just that one job and not have to have 7 jobs. There was a poll a while ago. I don't remember who put it out. You could probably find it and post it along with this, that found that a significant percentage of modern Orthodox rabbis had several jobs. Often it was a shul job and then a teaching job on the side. And that was incredibly common. And partly it's just people not everyone is a billionaire, but it might be, what are people choosing to invest their money in? And again, you get what you pay for kind of thing.
It was really interesting to me as a rabbinical student. I participated in a few different interfaith programs with students from other religions and denominations. And I remember at one of them, we were in Texas, and I was talking with a bunch of different denominations of Christian students. And I was just fascinated by the difference of our programs. They were fascinated by the difference in my program, how their program was much, much cheaper, but it was also only 2 years long. And their jobs did pay less than I think most rabbinical positions did in the pulpit. But at the same time, right, they didn't have the debt going into it prior. And also they were in places like that. I think is one of the hardest parts, right? To be an observant Jew, not only do you have kashrut, right? I wanted to cry when I saw what non-kosher steaks cost the other day at the supermarket, because the kosher steaks I've been buying for decades are so much more. And I think even more here in Canada, the kosher certification is even more expensive here. But we also have to live in big metropolitan cities for the most part, is where a lot of synagogues are.
Yeah.
While these Christian communities can live in places that really have a much lower cost of living, and it's much more doable to raise a family of 4 or 5 on significantly less. So it's an interesting question, I think, for the sustainability of some of the movements in our faith, is to think about how are we going to be able to restructure how we do this to provide for future leaders? I've
Yeah.
talked to so many students that I think would be great rabbis who tell me that maybe in the future, but they're going to go to, right, university students who tell me they want to work for at least a decade or so before they can even contemplate that because of the cost. You mentioned a little bit Maharat. So my question is, as a male Orthodox rabbi, but have you noticed a trend in the acceptance and all of that of these now female rabbinic type figures or leaders or rabbis? I don't even know what the right word is.
Yeah.
To be fair, that are graduating from that.
No, so there's a lot of interesting things in that question there. One about how they're called. Maharat is an acronym. I don't remember what every single letter stands for, but like a teacher of Torah, which is what these women are. Some of them have chosen to call themselves rabbah, like the feminine form of rabbi, and a few of them just call themselves rabbi.
Right, it's up to the student, right, what title they want to take.
Well, so I think there's two parts to that. I think the student has a huge, certainly the student can say, call me whatever you want. But I think it goes back to the community. And this is so important because there's a separate question here is, what does an Orthodox rabbi think about women rabbis? And again, as with most opinions in Jewish law, there's a spectrum. And a lot of it, the truth is that a lot of it is personal feelings because there's not a lot of sources to go on because the idea of having a woman in a leadership role and just historically didn't exist in any religion or any kind of society at all. So Jewish law wouldn't really have been exploring it. But one of the sources that I've seen used a lot, again, from this classical work on Jewish law, the Shulchan Aruch, the Set Table, which was written by a Sephardic rabbi and Ashkenazi rabbi. Ashkenazi rabbi, Rabbi Moshe Isserlis, I believe that this was from him, ultimately talked about the standards for a rabbi. What does a rabbi have to be? And one of the things he talked about is, no, you can only become a rabbi when you're essentially accepted by a community. And at the end of the day, as long as a community accepts a woman as their rabbi, that's kind of all that really matters in the end, because there's some people that can claim, oh, there's a source here that kind of says women shouldn't be rabbi, but none of them are really knockout punches. And a lot of them you have to finesse to say that. At the end of the day, there's not really an opinion one way or the other. The only thing we have to go on is there've never been women rabbis before. So either we keep the status quo because that's what we do, tradition, or we say let each community decide what's right for them. And that's true of YCT rabbis. An ultra-Orthodox community wouldn't accept me, but that's fine because I wouldn't fit there. But there are more communities that have said we're okay with a women rabbi, but as a general question, I can't really tell you, like I haven't talked to, the near 16 million Jews in the world to get a sense of where they are. But in terms of controversy, my sense is that it's really died down a lot. And whether that's because people are more accepting or because it's not the hot topic issue anymore and people don't really care. And it's just, we yelled, we cried, it happened. Some of these women have jobs now and we're done. So if you ask certain, rabbis or Jews, are you okay with women rabbis? Some will say, absolutely not. Some will say it's great, we should have more. And some will say, I don't really care. But my opinion is whoever's right for their community, that's who they should have.
What about in terms of the approach to homosexuality in the Orthodox community? It's actually a question we've been debating ourselves here this past year at Beth Tikvah, issues of same-sex marriage. Which only recently now we've passed and are now clergy in the building or we're permitted to have those types of ceremonies here. I was very happy. I was the first clergy person in our synagogue to perform a same-sex wedding. It was I think the highlight of the year was New Year's Eve, actually, and then the rest of the year kind of just went downhill after that. But my question is, have you noticed different approaches to that now in the Orthodox community? I know, as far as I know, there's no mainstream movement that permits same-sex marriage, but it seems to me that there's a much wider set of approach as opposed to simply it's a sin, don't do that, you have to fight those urges.
So I think that there's this old saying, and I don't think it's a Jewish saying, it might have come from, it may be very new, but the idea of hate the sin, not the sinner, which is certainly not the ideal. But
I think it's Jewish. I believe Jesus was the one who said that, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, that's interesting. So it's very old, and it is from a Jew then. If I had said it in the Latin, it would have been easier then. But that idea, I think, has become very widespread in Orthodox Judaism, which is a step in the right direction. There's certainly Orthodox Jews who will rail against homosexuals and say that it's their choice and they're choosing to sin, which I'll say unequivocally is not true. Someone who is gay, it is part of their identity. It's genetic. And, they have no more choice about who they're attracted to than you or me. But I think there's generally more acceptance of people who are gay and that they, not that it's okay for them to be part of our community, but just a general acceptance and embrace of them. Now, in terms of the actual act, of two men having sex with each other, there's a little bit more of a movement to say like, okay, so that act is clearly forbidden. But there are other things, being in a relationship, dating, holding hands, et cetera, like that are in at least the more liberal wings of Orthodoxy are becoming more acceptable. Look, the Torah is very unequivocally clear, or at least that's certainly the Orthodox understanding. But other things which rabbinically are prohibited, the rabbis, do not permit men to be intimate with each other in other ways. But I think there's more of a sense of maybe there's some movement that can be happening there, and there are rabbis working towards that, not to go against Jewish law, but to recognize new realities, and maybe there's new kinds of relationships. And the one that I've heard now, which is it's not feasible, it's not tenable, and it's painful and hurtful to say, but it's where a lot of Orthodox Jews are now, is to say two men can be in a relationship as long as they're totally celibate. So I am not pushing for that. I don't think it's as damaging as conversion therapy, but it's really not reasonable to ask most men to be in a totally celibate thing, although there's a lot of people that say, officially, that's what we hold. You can be in a relationship but be celibate, but we're not going to ask you what goes on in your bedroom. So I think that's where like the friction is happening, where the conversation is happening on Jews or on gay Jews, et cetera. And in terms of marriage, I don't think that's not true. There's one rabbi who did do a ceremony for a gay couple, but I don't know if he considered it to be a traditional Jewish wedding, like the Hebrew word kiddushin, like formal in the eyes of Jewish law. So for example, like if I have two friends who are men and they're married, I would consider them married in secular law, but not in Jewish law. And I think that's where the vast majority, if not, most Orthodox Jews is there's no such thing as Jewish marriage for a gay couple, but secular marriage we're more comfortable with. And I think a lot of Orthodox Jews are recognizing that. And in terms of what's permitted, in terms of their physical relationship, pretty much everyone is, they can't sleep together, but other things, there's small conversations. And I don't think any rabbi, including myself, is going out there and giving big blanket permissions, I'm formally accepting everything they do. But there are conversations with individual couples who say, like, if we can't be together, like, we can't be happy. It actually, like, it's killing us to not be together. And a rabbi might say, you can do this, but not that, et cetera. So that's very small conversations happening little by little.
It's interesting. It's really interesting to me the way you phrased it, because those are the same conversations that are happening in the conservative movement. Right. On the one hand, it's tough because right now they're actually the rabbinical assembly, the leadership of the organization of the rabbis, as well as the United Synagogue, the leadership organization for the actual movement and the synagogue branch, are not always in step on this, because on the one hand, the movements come out with very wide-ranging statements about support for transsexuals and things like that, while the halachic opinion of the law committee is still your whatever gender your genitalia is, which is very much not in line with the kind of statements that are coming out of the movement. And same with the approach to same-sex marriage. The most liberal opinion that actually passed the law committee, I'm not sure if you've read them or not, the tshuva that we accepted here at the synagogue of Rabbis Dorff, Nevins, and Reisner.
Is this when they came out with like numerous opinions? They said all of these are valid options?
Yeah, well, we had that on so many different issues. Which is the problem.
Yeah.
Gelatin's kosher and not kosher. And it depends then what rabbis, why sometimes the identity in the movement is difficult. But while some opinions said that no contact between two men whatsoever is okay, that was actually the exact opinion of the tshuva that passed the committee permitting it, was that deoraita, sex between two men is forbidden, but other acts that are only derabbanan, rabbinic prohibitions, those we were able to work with due to those other concerns about really human dignity and the pain and suffering that's brought to someone, to say, it's fine, you love this person, but you can never engage in any kind of physical contact or anything. So it's very interesting to see that in those ways, right? The movement is playing out the same way in the liberal wing of the Orthodoxy, although in practice, I think most conservative Jews really have what they believe is right or wrong on this. You don't really care what the law committee thinks about it.
No, I think you picked up on something important, which is this cognitive dissonance, again, like what's written in the books. And in Orthodoxy, we get this all the time. This is the halacha, which there's no such thing as the halacha, but like there's a very clear ruling here, but people say, oh, I'm not going to do that. Anyways, this has been going on for hundreds of years. You have what's written on the books and what people actually do. And one of the interesting things is historically to look at rabbis who have then gone back after the point and tried to defend and say, no, the people, the reason they weren't doing this practice is they must have gotten a tradition from somewhere else, which is beautiful to defend what the people are doing. So that cognitive dissonance is real. You also mentioned gelatin, and I think it's related to this topic, which is, I don't know how monolithic or, in the conservative movement, if there's generally, at least in the upper echelons, like formally, it seems like there's more agreement. Even if there's multiple opinions, everyone's kind of in conversation. Orthodoxy, it's much, much more fractured, both in the different Orthodox movements, modern Orthodox, centrists, et cetera, but even synagogue to synagogue and country to country. In Israel, I believe it's the rabbinate, the chief rabbinate, which tends to be lenient on certain issues around kashrut, allows for gelatin, in their specific way. But in America, it's absolutely forbidden, verboten. We would never have gelatin, but both are, full-blown Orthodox. So what's the difference there? So Orthodoxy, we talk about the questions on homosexuality. You ask 10 modern Orthodox rabbis, and you'll hear very different narratives. So I'm trying to touch on some of like the general conversations that are happening. And I think that a lot of rabbis would say, yeah, those are the conversations that are happening, but we're all going to agree or have different opinions on what should happen and how it should happen. That's often the conversation. Is a lot of rabbis say, oh, I agree that women should have more roles and even women rabbis could be a thing, but I disagree with how you're going about it, which is kind of a cop-out, but that's a very common trope. Is Jewish law does change, it can change, it should change, but the way that you want to change it is not the right way. And I think that was a conversation that happened with Orthodoxy and Conservative Judaism in the 50s and 60s, and it's happening in the different wings of Orthodoxy today. I agree fundamentally with your principles, but not how you're getting there.
It's interesting. When I first moved here, I was shocked. I used to do a lot of hashgacha work, kashrut supervision in LA for Camp Ramah. I actually did a couple of events for Milken and some other things there. I had a popsicle stand at a local mall that I hechshered because he wanted to also have his cart at some synagogues for bar and bat mitzvah ceremonies. And I was shocked when I came here then to Canada, and I found out that the local rabbinic organization hechshered Scotch aged in non-kosher sherry casks, because no mainstream kosher organization in the U.S. would accept that. And the reasoning, as it was explained to me, was by one of the mashgiachs from the organization, was that they used the idea of nullified in 1/60th, batal b'shishim, right? That if it's less than one, I'm just explaining it for the audience. If it's less than 1/60th the amount of the general mixture, it's okay. But the issue there is that it's, where you and I know, it's as long as it was accidental, right? That one, that you can't taste it in the final mixture, even if it was accidental, and two, that it wasn't deliberately put in. But specifically, this Scotch is sold, right? I'm a fan of those types of liquors. It's sold for that reason.
You pull your prop out.
It's only a prop. But it's sold for that reason, that you can taste it, right? The claim is that it tastes better because it's aged in this cask. So I can't see any way to justify that from that position, except, right, I would be okay with it because I hold by the opinion of Rabbi Dorff, the tshuva from the conservative movement, about non-hechshered wine and why that's okay for various reasons. So it was interesting right there, because there's one where, in the end, me and the COR both agree that you can drink it, but for very different reasons. And I can't wrap my head at all around the reasoning of them. And I imagine they the same feel the exact same way about me and my reasoning for it.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. Two things. One, you and I have been friends, really best friends for many, many years. But the question, the topic that you just shows that there's still some things that you miss about me. Like, I don't drink. I'm a teetotaler. But it's funny because a lot of people, in fact, I said, I don't get a lot of halakhic questions. I've had multiple congregants and people come to me and ask about the sherry cask thing. And I've looked it up and read about it, and I just don't get it. I just don't know anything about alcohol. But you bring up a really important topic here, which is local authority and who to rely on for opinions. Because one of the things, again, in Orthodoxy is the idea is that we don't just pick and choose, what opinions that we like. We have to hold by an accepted rabbinic decider. So again, I've mentioned Rav Moshe Feinstein before, passed away, I think in the 80s. And he represented really for Eastern European Ashkenazi Jews in America for decades. He was the rabbi. So if I decide to hold by him, I'm in good company. But it's not just that. So you got to pick a rabbi who's accepted. And again, everyone disagrees with your rabbis are accepted, mine are not, although he's pretty universally respected. But you also go by local custom. So if you come back to America and start drinking, whiskey that's been aged in a sherry cask, will people look at you and say, you're breaking law, how dare you? But then you go to, your community in Canada and they're like, oh, we all do this here. And it's the same thing with gelatin. I am an American Orthodox Jew. I do not hold that gelatin is kosher. So can I eat it when I live in Israel? Can I just decide to change my practice then and pick and choose my rabbis, et cetera, like that? And that's in Orthodoxy, again, it's really not monolithic because there's so many factors over how I decide what does it mean to be totally observant of Jewish law? Who defines that law? And again, for most things, the fact that I don't eat pork and the fact that I don't drive on Shabbat, and there's much more to my observance than that. There are definitely universals that a lot of Orthodox Jews have in common with how they eat. And basically kashrut and Shabbat, those are two of the fairly consistent things across Orthodoxy writ large. But everything else, it's wild. And again, I think there are things that separate Orthodoxy and Conservative Judaism in terms of practice and perhaps philosophy and theology. But in terms of the challenges we face and how practically we go about them and what our congregations are actually doing about them, not much different. And it'd be interesting to think if that's similar in Reform. I don't imagine as much. We're certainly all facing similar challenges. But I think that's important. There's more that connects us than divides us. Even though I am very strongly a modern Orthodox Jew, I recognize the conservative movement is still very much part of the conversation.
I appreciate one of the things I always loved our friendship was that we could have those types of conversations. I had other friends that moved to the Orthodox world, and I felt there was always a bit of disdain when they looked back behind them. And I really think you recognize, right, the rest of us that, not me personally, because we grew up together, but the movement that, gave you this strong rooted love of Judaism. And you've always been very appreciative, I think, to those institutions and organizations. I'm also a big fan of Rav Feinstein, but more actually I hold by his student. I don't know if you're aware, at least according to Wikipedia, Jackie Mason received his smicha from Rav Feinstein. And Rabbi Mason is actually, he's my ultimate final authority in most of those issues. Before we wrap up, we've gone a little bit over it. Can I ask you 2 more questions or just one? It's up to you.
Yeah, sure. Two is fine.
Just briefly, could you tell us, because we've talked a lot on the show about how COVID has affected synagogues, but again, it's one of those issues of in the conservative world, there's different opinions and approaches to the use of electricity and virtual seders and things like that. So I'm curious, how has your community, in particular in the Orthodox world in general, responded to these issues of not being able to gather physically in the area of COVID, while also, as far as I know, not relying on those kinds of electronic devices on Shabbat.
Like having virtual services, et cetera, like that.
Yeah.
I've actually been learning with one of our rabbinic colleagues, Texas Rabbi Ariel Scholklapper, and we're recently learning a book by a very prominent Orthodox rabbi, Rabbi Asher Weiss, and he goes through the different opinions on electricity. And the truth is that, on the surface, electricity is worse than idolatry. That's the way everyone approaches it, but it's much more complex behind the scenes. So what that led to is when this all started, there were a number of rabbis in Israel, again, mainstream accepted, brilliant Orthodox rabbis, who came out with an opinion. And they didn't really say, turn on your computer. They said you could leave your computer on in the background on mute for relatives who are much older, who would be physically dangerous for them to come to the Seder, so they could
This was
have
the
the
Seder,
experience.
yeah.
And not only dangerous, they could catch COVID-19, but also emotionally, if they were alone, it's just bad for them. Came out with that opinion, and then it was just dragged through the mud. But it wasn't I disagree with this opinion, and I don't think people should follow it because of these arguments, which that's fine, and I might do that as well. It was these rabbis have no idea what they're doing, they're fools, and this is horrible, and they're destroying the Jewish world. And again, that's usually you say that when you don't have a real argument. But the reason I bring that up is to say that Orthodoxy has been trying to find some balance there. However, because of the way it started with these rabbis who their names they either recanted or they were just dragged through the mud, I don't think any other mainstream or major Orthodox institution has tried to, do it again, has tried to introduce virtual services, including my congregation. While there are certain issues where I'm definitely more open, and I don't know if progressive is the right word, but like in terms of like observance, like pretty middle of the road. So I'm not trying to do any major changes out there, but I don't know of any synagogues that are really exploring that right now. And it is a huge challenge. For the high holidays, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, if we could have virtual services, we would absolutely do that, but we won't. And we have to figure out ways to reach out to people and do meaningful things without endangering their lives. And it's tough. It's really tough. It's a huge challenge. And I think even the congregations that are going virtual, it's still far from ideal. Sitting in front of Zoom, no one's going to watch this. Who's going to want to watch two rabbis, schmooze for over an hour? It just gets very boring. But
let alone rabbis for 4 hours with a choir and all of that.
And one of my friends told me that that's what they're doing. They're abridging it a little bit from a conservative synagogue. They're going to pre-record it, cut out a little bit, but they're going to have the choir doing all like the Brady Bunch, where everyone's in a different box or something like that.
What are you guys doing for the holidays, if I may ask?
So right now we haven't, so in case any of my congregants are watching this, because officially we haven't decided, but our default mode, if things continue, unfortunately in Milwaukee and Wisconsin, the numbers of cases are going up as of today, and have been for a while, is on Erev Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, like well before the evening before it starts, we're going to have a virtual service, and we won't, and that's another challenge for Orthodoxy, is whether to hold the quorum, the minyan, and to do formal services, the repetition of the Amidah, etc. So I think some Orthodox congregations are being a little more flexible, but my congregation and most are not. So we can't really do the service, but we can sing some of the prayers, Unatana Tokef, we can chant prayer of like Who by Fire, etc., the very powerful ones. And I'll give by sermon. I'll certainly give that live. And then if we can find a safe way to do it, we're going to try and go to a huge field near Lake Michigan, which we're very close to. And we'll have a father and son blow the shofar from like 50, 60 feet away where everyone can hear it. And everyone will do their own tashlich in a safe way with masks, etc. So if things change, again, I'm not committing to that in case someone's watching. But that's the model that we're exploring right now. And I think one of the things is, it sucks. What's going on right now is just awful and terrible, and it's not ideal. And to pretend that it is, and for people to say, well, you got to make it the best it possibly can. Okay, that's fine. But it's also okay to recognize that this year is not going to be the same, and it's not going to be good. And it doesn't mean that meaningful things aren't happening. I used to see people on Shabbat. I don't now. So what do? I call every congregant or send them messages. I reach out to them. I spend every Sunday 3 or 4 hours reaching out to all my congregants. And I'm connecting with them in ways I never did when I would daven, pray, and then schmooze at Kiddush for 5 minutes, over eating crackers. So in no way am I suggesting that this has been a good thing overall. But there are some ways that people are connecting now that we didn't before.
Absolutely. There are definitely positives that have been coming out of all this. So we have the same problems, right? Things are changing. We're not locking into any one plan because nobody knows what the future holds.
Yeah.
But the same thing, even though we are doing an online service, we have people that want, right, they see what's going on at some of these synagogues that have been doing online services for 10, 15 years.
Yeah.
And they have production companies, they have camera angles, they have live producers, right? If that's what you're looking for, right, our service isn't going to be that. It's what we're telling them. right? What it's going to have, though, is our clergy trying our best to make a sense of connection. But again, also with, like you talked about, we're looking at ideas like shofar service in our cars, or it's a slight difference for you guys. But tashlik, things like that we can do socially distanced as well.
Yeah.
Because people just don't look at someone in the eyes in person,
So
even
physically
if you
distanced,
can't.
but socially connected.
Yeah. Even if you can't touch them, right? It's more right to be 6 feet away than to be looking at a screen, right? You and I right now.
Now I just want to give you a hug.
I really wish we could someday soon. It'd be great. I'd love to come visit you and see you in your community, and to see your children and everything that I haven't gotten to really meet and spend time with. Would be wonderful. My final question, just to everyone that's been on the show, is there a piece of Torah that's significant to you that you can share with us? It doesn't have to be on the Parsha. It doesn't have to be Torah. It can be Talmud. Whatever it is, a Jewish teaching that really has been an important part of your life.
Absolutely. There's actually, it's lucky that I have one piece that I learned a few years ago that always is good if there's like one message I want to give, and it's from the Maharal of Prague. And the Maharal, again, it's an acronym, Rabbi Lowe, who was famous for supposedly having made the golem in his shul. And actually visited a shul in Prague. And in one of his works, so I won't quote it, precisely, I don't remember the exact language, but he essentially says that the default position is when someone asks you a challenging question, the default might be to say that challenges, religion, faith, et cetera, is to say, get out of here. I don't want to hear it. How dare you question anything? And he says that that's a sign of weakness. To say that we can't handle those questions is showing that our religion, our faith is not strong enough. Rather, we should embrace and accept all questions. Sometimes the answer may be, I don't know. But if we really stand behind our faith, then we need to be open to exploring every topic. You didn't ask explicitly, but that's really why I chose YCT. And the greatest thing about it is they don't officially have rulings on every controversial issue, but they make a space to discuss all of them so that we understand the nuances and the humanity behind it. Even if the answer is one that people don't like, at least we take all the questions. And Judaism can only continue and grow and be strong if we take all of the challenges and ask the deep, meaningful questions. And Rabbi Lowe knew that hundreds of years ago, and he taught it to me, and now I'm teaching it to you and your congregation.
I love that. It's a great quote, actually. I've used that before in a class on free speech, which I'm very passionate about, that every idea, there are things maybe as a decent person we shouldn't say, but that any idea, right, shouldn't be outlawed. And I love that quote and that idea. And I just have to tell everyone listening in that with so many other rabbis, I gave them the questions in advance and said, is this okay with you? Is this okay with you? And everyone really was okay with everything I wanted to talk about. But you really said to me from the outset, whatever you want to talk about, right? Whatever you want to talk about, it's all fair game. I might agree, I might disagree, but whatever topics you want to discuss, we can discuss. And it's great to see how you really have embodied that principle and that teaching, both from the Maharal of Prague as well as from Yeshiva Chovei Torah. They've created you a leader who's open to really deep, meaningful conversations with nothing off topic. Because that's the only way we can get better at what we do is being willing to debate and discuss. So I want to thank you, Rabbi Dinin, so much for joining us tonight, for being with us. And I want to thank everyone for tuning in for another episode of Learning with My Rabbis. We're back together again next Wednesday. So we hope you join us. Rabbi Dinin, have a wonderful rest of your night. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Sachs. It was a great pleasure.
If you gossip about him, if you never have mercy, if he